Hello, my friend. I'm glad you're here. I mean that in the specific way, not as a pleasantry, but as a genuine thing. You came here tonight to rest, and I think that is worth honoring. So let me do my part. Let me take care of the next little while for you. Before we begin, I want to ask something of you, and I'll ask it the way I always do. If this channel has ever given you something, a night of better sleep, a story that stayed with you in a quiet way, a feeling of being gently accompanied into the dark, then please consider subscribing and leaving a like on this one. It costs you nothing but a moment, and what it does is help this little channel find someone else who needs it. Someone, somewhere, lying awake right now, who doesn't yet know we're here. That's all I'm ever asking for. Just that. Thank you. Now, where are you tonight? I find myself genuinely curious. Are you in a bedroom somewhere in the American Midwest? Ohio maybe, or Indiana? With the particular kind of winter quiet that settles over those flat landscapes after 10 o'clock, the heating clicking softly in the walls, the street outside empty and orange lit. Are you in a flat in Edinburgh, the old stone kind, with rain moving across the window in slow diagonal lines and the city going dark around you? Or maybe you're somewhere quite far from here, a house in New Zealand or in Queensland, where it's actually warm tonight, where the window might be cracked open just slightly and the sound coming in is crickets or a distant road or something you couldn't quite name if I asked you to. Wherever you are, I'd love to know. Leave it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one of them, and there is something that moves me, honestly moves me, about knowing the specific places where these stories find people in the dark. All right, let's get you settled. If you haven't already, dim whatever light is near you. Not total darkness, just dimmer, the kind of light that makes edges soft. Let your jaw unclench. You may not have noticed it was clenched. It was. Let it go. Let your shoulders drop. Actually drop them, deliberately, because they are almost certainly higher than they need to be. And your legs. Let them go heavy. Don't hold them. Let the bed or the couch or the floor take them completely. Breathe in slowly, and let the breath out even more slowly than that. Good. Here is what I want to tell you tonight. When Nikola Tesla's body was found on the morning of January 8, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan, he had been dead for approximately 24 hours. The maid who found him, a woman named Alice Monahan, had to override the Do Not Disturb sign on the door. It had been there long enough that she overrode it. That is the detail I keep coming back to. Not just that he died alone, but that the sign was there, that he had put it there, that even at the very end, in his 80s, in the final slow days of a long and extraordinary and deeply troubled life, Nikola Tesla's last message to the world was, "Do not come in. Do not disturb me." Tonight I want to talk about why. Not the myth of it, not the story of the misunderstood genius crushed by a heartless world, which is the version that gets told most often, and which is, I think, only partially true and rather too comfortable. I want to talk about the actual, documented, complicated, and genuinely human reasons that one of the most brilliant people who ever lived died in a hotel room alone. The choices he made, the people he drove away or allowed to drift, the particular nature of his mind, which was both his great gift and the slow architecture of his own isolation. He put that sign on the door. Let me take you back to the beginning of how it got there. The Do Not Disturb sign had been on the door handle long enough that the maid, Alice Monahan, finally decided to override it. That is where this story ends. And because of where it ends, I think it deserves to be told from the beginning. Hello, my friend. You've come here to rest, and I'm glad you did. Before we go anywhere, let me ask you something small. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, would you consider doing it now? Not because I need you to, but because it genuinely helps this little project find the people it was made for. And if tonight's story moves you the way it moves me, a like costs you nothing and means quite a lot. Thank you, genuinely. Now, where are you listening from tonight? I always want to know. Maybe you're in a bedroom somewhere in Ohio. The house finally quiet, the blanket pulled up to your chin. Maybe you're in a flat in Edinburgh, with rain sliding down the glass, and the radiator clicking softly in the corner. Maybe you're in a kitchen in New Zealand, the rest of the house asleep, the kettle long gone cold. Wherever you are, leave it in the comments. I read them, and I love knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Now, let's settle in properly. If the lights aren't already dimmed, dim them. Let your jaw go. You've been holding it all day. You can put it down now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your legs go heavy into whatever is beneath you. Feel the weight of your own body. You're safe here. You don't have to do anything. Just listen. Comfortable? Good. Let me take you somewhere. January 8th, 1943, Manhattan. The New Yorker Hotel, 33rd floor. The corridor is dim at this hour. The carpet the particular dull red of mid-century hotel hallways, worn pale along the center by years of foot traffic. The air smells of old wool and radiator heat, and the faint, persistent ghost of cigarette smoke that has worked itself into every surface. A winter morning, the light through the corridor windows, where there are any, is thin and grey, the flat, metallic grey of a New York January that has forgotten the sun exists. Alice Monaghan has a cart, folded linen, the chemical sharpness of cleaning solution. She moves down the hall with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She stops at room 3327. The Do Not Disturb sign is on the handle. It is a small cardboard rectangle, the kind you might barely notice, but she notices it because she has noticed it before. It has been there long enough that she makes the decision, quietly, without drama, to override it. She knocks. There is no answer. She knocks again. Still nothing. She opens the door. I want to pause here, before we go any further, because I think the details of the next few moments deserve to be held very carefully. The room is dim. The curtains are drawn against the January morning. There is the smell of birdseed, an unusual smell for a hotel room, particular and unmistakable, sweet and dusty at once. There is the smell of the chemical cleaning solution that Tesla had always requested, specifically and in considerable quantity. The room is quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when they have been quiet for a very long time. Nikola Tesla is in his bed. He is fully clothed. He has been dead for approximately 24 hours. He is 86 years old. He is one of the most significant electrical engineers who ever lived. He changed the physical world, its wires, its current, its light. And he has been lying here, alone, for a full day before anyone thought to check. I find this genuinely difficult to sit with. Not because death itself is difficult. Death comes for everyone, and there is no cruelty in dying old. But because of the 24 hours, because of the sign on the door, because of what that sign in some quiet and unbearable way represents. He had put it there himself. That is the detail worth sitting with. He had asked the world, please, not to disturb him, and the world in the end had been happy to comply. Let me tell you something about the New Yorker Hotel, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising, and because I think it matters to understanding what kind of ending this was. The New Yorker Hotel opened in 1930 at 481 8th Avenue, just a short walk from Penn Station. When it opened, it was the largest hotel in the world, 2,500 rooms, rising 23 stories above 8th Avenue, a city inside a city. It had its own power plant in the basement, its own dry cleaning facility, its own hospital, its own barbershop, capable of handling 100 customers simultaneously. There were 4,000 employees at peak operation. The lobby alone could swallow a city block. The historian and architectural critic Paul Goldberger has described the New Yorker as one of the last great monuments to the idea that a hotel could function as a complete civilization unto itself. It was not, however, the Waldorf Astoria. And that distinction matters enormously when you understand where Tesla had once lived. In the 1890s, at the absolute height of his fame, and we will talk about that height in full very shortly, Tesla kept rooms at the Waldorf Astoria. He ran up a bill there, over the years, of approximately $20,000. This was an almost incomprehensible sum. He dined in the grand dining room. He entertained the richest and most famous people in the country at his table. He was, as the biographer W. Bernard Carlson documents in his meticulous 2013 biography of Tesla, a figure who understood the social power of spectacle and luxury, and who deployed both with considerable skill. By 1933, he was living at the New Yorker on a stipend of approximately $100 per month, paid by the Westinghouse Electric Company. A partial, belated, quietly institutional act of loyalty, a nod, perhaps, to the unrepayable debt the company owed him. Westinghouse Electric had been built, in no small part, on the alternating current motor that Tesla had invented and that George Westinghouse had licensed. Without Tesla, there might not have been a Westinghouse Electric Company. The $100 a month was not gratitude. It was, more honestly, something closer to guilt made manageable. The room he occupied, rooms 3327 and the adjoining 3325, was described by those rare visitors who made it up to the 33rd floor as dim, quiet, and accumulating. Papers, notebooks, the detritus of a mind that had never stopped working, even as the world had largely stopped listening. And the pigeons, always, in his final decade, the pigeons, clustering on the windowsill, their soft mechanical murmuring a kind of company. Back with Tesla now, in the room on the 33rd floor. The cause of death would be listed as coronary thrombosis. His heart had simply stopped. This was not unexpected for a man of 86. The doctors found nothing particularly unusual. What was unusual, what is genuinely arresting, if you let yourself look at it clearly, is not how he died. It is the conditions of his dying. The coroner's examination would note that he showed signs of prolonged undernourishment. He had been eating very little for some time. There is no indication that anyone had been monitoring this. There is no indication that anyone had been checking, in any sustained way, whether he was eating at all. The biographer Mark Cypher, whose exhaustive biography Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, remains one of the most detailed accounts we have, has noted that Tesla's final years at the New Yorker were characterized by a withdrawal so complete, so deliberately constructed, that even the hotel staff who saw him regularly could not have said with any confidence whether he was well or unwell. He gave them no information. He asked them for nothing except his birdseed and his cleaning solution. He was courteous, formal, and utterly closed. Within hours of Alice Monahan's discovery, agents from the Office of Alien Property arrived at the New Yorker hotel. They removed approximately 2 truckloads of Tesla's papers, notebooks, correspondence, technical drawings, the accumulated documentation of a lifetime of work. The justification was wartime security. Tesla had spent his final years claiming to be developing a directed energy weapon he called Teleforce. The press had called it a death ray, and the government wanted to ensure the documents did not fall into enemy hands. Whether those documents contained anything of genuine military value is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is the speed of the seizure. The man had been dead less than a day. Before his body was even cold in the official sense, the state arrived to take what was left of his mind. No family was present, no close friends, no colleagues of the old years. Just the room, and the dim January light, and the pigeons still waiting on the windowsill, not yet understanding why the window had stopped opening. This is not just the death of an old man who had outlived his time. This is the end of a very specific journey, one that began in celebration, in astonishing public triumph, in a fame so bright and so warm that it is almost impossible to reconcile with that cold, quiet room. Tesla's aloneness was not an accident of age or history. It accumulated, choice by choice, severed connection by severed connection, year by year. And that the date is August 1893, and if you were standing on the lakefront of Chicago, at the grounds of the World's Columbian Exposition after dark, You would have seen something that had no name yet in your experience. Not exactly. You had seen candles. You had seen gas lamps, their particular yellowish wavering, the way they made shadows that moved. But this was different. This was white. This was steady. This was, by any accounting available to a person in that moment, miraculous. 200,000 incandescent lamps. That is the number most historians settle on. 200,000 lights burning simultaneously, strung along the buildings and the pathways, and the great basin of water at the center of the fairgrounds, their reflections doubling in the lake so that the whole scene seemed to float between two skies. Visitors who left written accounts of that night, and many of them did, because it was the kind of experience that made people reach for their diaries, used words like unearthly and heavenly and beyond description. One woman wrote that she simply stood still and wept, and could not afterward explain why. The power behind all of it was alternating current, and the system that made alternating current viable, the patents, the intellectual architecture of the whole apparatus, belonged to Nikola Tesla. He would have been 36 years old that summer, lean, tall, over 6 feet, which was unusual for the era. He dressed with meticulous care, always, even then, before the habits became something stranger and more rigid. He wore gloves when he could, because he found the sensation of other people's skin against his own deeply uncomfortable. He counted things, steps, mouthfuls, the number of napkins he would fold before sitting down to a meal. The biographer W. Bernard Carlson, in his 2013 study of Tesla, that remains perhaps the most rigorously documented account of his life, noted that these compulsions were present from Tesla's earliest adult years and intensified over time. They were not eccentricities he had chosen, the way a fashionable man might choose a walking stick. They were the texture of his daily experience, the scaffolding he built around himself to make the world feel navigable. And yet, in the photographs from that period, he is composure itself. He stands in his laboratory on South Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a building he leased and fitted out with equipment that would have seemed like theatre props to anyone who didn't understand what they were. And he holds a tube of glowing gas in each hand, current moving through his body and out again, his face calm, almost amused, while the lights burn around him without burning him. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the physics completely. But he also understood performance. He understood that the world received ideas through spectacle, and he was willing to give it spectacle. Let me tell you something about the War of Currents, because I think most people know the outline of it and miss the part that I find genuinely fascinating. By the late 1880s, Thomas Edison had built an electrical empire around direct current, DC power. His systems were already running in parts of New York City, and he was not, by any standard, a man who accepted competition gracefully. When George Westinghouse began promoting the alternating current system that Tesla had patented, a system that could transmit power over vastly greater distances than Edison's DC could manage, Edison responded not with engineering, but with propaganda. He understood, correctly, that the public's fear of electricity could be weaponized. He began staging demonstrations. There is no neutral way to describe this. Edison's associates, and on some occasions men directly in his employ, publicly electrocuted animals with alternating current to demonstrate its danger. Dogs, calves. In 1903, years after the commercial war had effectively been decided, an elephant named Topsy was electrocuted at Coney Island. Though Edison's direct involvement in that particular event is disputed by historians, the AC current used was part of the same rhetorical tradition he had established. He even lobbied, unsuccessfully but genuinely, for alternating current to be used in the electric chair and for the act of execution by electricity to be called Westinghousing. The goal was contamination, to make the name synonymous with death. It did not work, not technically and not commercially. The Westinghouse system, built on Tesla's patents, won the contract to illuminate the world's Columbian Exposition. And then it won something larger still. In 1895, the first major hydroelectric power station at Niagara Falls began transmitting AC power to the city of Buffalo, 26 miles away. It was the first large-scale demonstration in history that electricity could be generated in one place and used in another, that the power in a river could become the light in a room miles distant. Tesla had theorized this. Now it was real. The hum of those generators, a low, constant vibration that visitors to the station described as something you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, was the sound of a new world beginning. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first spent real time with this period of Tesla's life, the early 1890s, the peak, the lights at Chicago, the falls at Niagara, my first instinct was the same instinct most people have. This is the triumphant chapter. This is the part where you feel uncomplicated joy about a man. And there is joy here. There genuinely is. But the biographer Carlson observed something that I keep returning to, and I think it matters for everything that comes later. Tesla at his most celebrated was also Tesla at his most alone. Not lonely necessarily. Loneliness implies a desire for connection that is being thwarted. Something quieter than that, and perhaps more permanent. He attended the dinner parties. He was welcomed into the drawing rooms of figures like Mark Twain and J.P. Morgan, and the writers and architects and composers who circulated through the cultural atmosphere of New York in that era. He was, by all accounts, wonderful company, witty, precise, capable of explaining complex ideas with sudden, beautiful simplicity. And then the dinner ended, and we can imagine, though we cannot know for certain, that he stepped back into the street, the late-night Manhattan streets with their particular smell of horse and coal smoke and the first faint chemical sharpness of the electrical age, and that some essential part of him remained exactly where it had always been, interior, unreachable, his own. He never married. He wrote, in later life, that he had consciously chosen his work over any intimate relationship, that he believed a life of romantic partnership would have diminished his focus. The records suggest he meant this, but the records also suggest, Carlson and the earlier biographer Mark Cypher both touch on this carefully, that the choice was not made once, in some clear-eyed moment of self-knowledge. It was made daily, in the small refusals, in the gloves, in the counted napkins, in the way he structured his world to prevent the unpredictable closeness of another person from entering it. Back on the floor of his South Fifth Avenue laboratory, the air smelled of ozone. It always did. Ozone is the scent of electricity finding its way through air. A clean, sharp, almost metallic smell, like the moment before a thunderstorm, concentrated and permanent. His assistants worked around him, and he directed them with precision, and the apparatus hummed and crackled with energies that most of the people on the street below could not have named or explained. He was at the center of it. He was, in every measurable way, at the center of the world. And he was, already, practicing for an ending he hadn't yet imagined. The lights of Chicago were still burning. Niagara was still ahead. But something in the architecture of his life, the deliberate distances he maintained, the self-sufficiency he cultivated like a discipline, was already, quietly, becoming the structure he would die inside. The papers were thick. That is one of the first things worth noticing, not metaphorically, but physically. A royalty contract in the 1890s was not a single page. It was a document with weight to it, folded in sections, the kind of thing that made a sound when you set it down on a desk. It had the particular smell of legal offices, ink and dust, and the faint sourness of men who had been working in close rooms for many hours. When Nikola Tesla held his royalty agreement with the Westinghouse Electric Company in his hands, sometime in the mid-1890s, the precise date is uncertain, and historians have placed the gesture at various points in that decade. He was holding something that represented, in practical terms, the financial foundation of the rest of his life. He tore it up. The host steps forward here, because I want to be honest with you about something before we go further. When I first encountered this story, the torn contract, the voluntary surrender, I assumed it was one of those things that gets simplified in the retelling, a legend that had been made cleaner and more dramatic than the reality. But the more I read, the more I came to believe that the gesture, in its essential form, was real. And the more real it became to me, the sadder it got. Because the question this section is really asking is not whether Tesla made bad financial decisions. He did, repeatedly, catastrophically. The question is, why? And whether the answer is simple enough to be satisfying, I find in the end that it is not. I find that the real answer is uncomfortable in the specific way that truths about complicated people tend to be uncomfortable. Let me show you what I mean. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about how patents and royalties actually worked in the Gilded Age, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because without it, you cannot understand the full scale of what Tesla walked away from. In the 1880s and 1890s, the American patent system was the engine of industrial fortune. An inventor who held a fundamental patent, one that covered not a specific application, but a core principle of a technology, could, in theory, collect a royalty on every single instance of that technology's commercial use. George Westinghouse understood this. Thomas Edison understood it. The great industrial lawyers of the period built entire careers around the art of patent litigation. The system was brutal and Byzantine and deeply unfair in many of its particulars, but it contained within it a genuine mechanism for rewarding invention with lasting income. Tesla's original agreement with Westinghouse was built on this principle. He had assigned his alternating current patents to the Westinghouse Company, and in return he was to receive royalties, a payment for each horsepower of electrical capacity generated using his system. The historian W. Bernard Carlson, whose 2013 biography, Tesla, Inventor of the Electrical Age, is one of the most rigorously researched accounts of Tesla's life, has described this arrangement as potentially extraordinarily valuable. Alternating current was winning. Westinghouse and Tesla had beaten Edison's direct current system at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a moment of genuine triumph that we'll return to in another section. The Niagara Falls Power Station, which used Tesla's polyphase system, began operating in 1895. The infrastructure of the modern electrical world was being built on the foundation of his patents. The royalties, had they been allowed to accumulate, would have made Tesla one of the wealthiest men in America. What those royalties would actually have been worth is genuinely difficult to calculate with precision. The counterfactual depends on too many variables. But Carlson and other scholars have suggested figures in the millions of dollars over the following decades, at a time when $1 million represented a kind of wealth that changed everything. It represented security. It represented independence. It represented, perhaps most importantly for a man of Tesla's temperament, the freedom to build whatever he wished to build without needing to please investors or partners or anyone at all. He gave it away. He tore up the contract. He told Westinghouse, in effect, that he would take a lump sum. Accounts vary on the precise figure, though it was significant at the time, in place of all future royalties. Back with Tesla now, and the question of why. The official story, the one Tesla himself seems to have encouraged, was generosity. Westinghouse, he reportedly said, had believed in him when no one else would. The company was under financial pressure. Allowing the royalties to continue would have potentially threatened the very enterprise that had given his work its first real home. And so he surrendered them, out of loyalty, out of gratitude, out of a largeness of spirit. I find this genuinely moving, and I also find it genuinely incomplete. Because here is what the records also suggest. Tesla had, throughout his life, a relationship to money that was not quite like other people's relationship to money. The biographer Margaret Cheney, in Tesla, Man Out of Time, Observed that Tesla operated in a financial world that seemed almost parallel to the real one, that he spent lavishly when he had money, lived as though the bills were someone else's problem when he didn't, and appeared to treat financial security as something that would simply arrange itself around his genius, rather than something he needed to actively construct and protect. This is not a cruel observation. It is a sad one, and it matters because it suggests that the torn contract was not purely an act of noble self-sacrifice. It may also have been an act of a man who did not fully understand what he was surrendering, or who understood it and felt, in that particular moment, that the future would provide. The future, of course, did not provide. Then there was the Waldorf Astoria. Tesla had lived at the Waldorf Astoria for years, the original Waldorf Astoria, on Fifth Avenue, a place of extraordinary grandeur, with marble floors that clicked under leather heels and chandeliers that hung so heavily above the dining room that looking up at them felt like a kind of vertigo. It was expensive. It was always expensive. And Tesla, who required beauty and order around him, who could not work in rooms he found ugly or chaotic, who dressed in immaculate suits and ate at fine restaurants not out of self-indulgence, but out of what seemed to be a genuine psychological necessity, Tesla could not stop being expensive even when he could not afford to be expensive. By the early 1900s, he had accumulated substantial debts to the hotel. The precise figures varied across different accounts, but they were serious enough to constitute a genuine crisis. And the way Tesla resolved this crisis, the deal he made, was, in its way, even more painful than the torn contract. He traded patents, specific patents, representing real intellectual property and potential future income, were handed over to satisfy hotel bills. The exact terms of this arrangement are not fully documented in surviving records, but its essential shape is not disputed. Tesla exchanged the residue of his patent portfolio for the forgiveness of debts accumulated in a hotel he could no longer afford to stay in. The weight of that transaction is hard to describe without it sounding theatrical, but I want to try. Imagine holding a room key, the particular heaviness of a hotel key in that era, brass or steel, engraved with the room number, and knowing that the price of that key, the price of keeping your rooms and your dignity in a place that at least looked like the life you had always imagined for yourself, was the quiet surrender of the things you had made with your mind. The creative work handed over for accommodation. The invention traded for the room. We cannot know exactly what Tesla felt in those moments. The records do not give us his interior in any direct way. But the biographer Carlson has noted carefully that Tesla by this period seemed to genuinely believe that larger funding, larger projects, larger patrons would always appear to restore whatever had been given away. The Wardenclyffe project, the great tower on Long Island that would be the subject of our next section, was already taking shape in his imagination. There was always something larger coming. And that, perhaps, is the saddest part of all. Not that Tesla was exploited, not that the world failed him, but that he gave away the quiet, ordinary security that might have kept him anchored to the world, in exchange for the belief that the extraordinary was always just ahead of him. He was wrong, and the distance between where he imagined he was going and where he actually arrived, that distance is in some ways the whole story of the loneliness that is waiting for us at the end of this. The tower was visible from miles away. If you stood on the flat eastern plain of Long Island in the summer of 1903 and looked north toward the village of Shoreham, you would see it rising out of the landscape like something that had no business being there. 187 feet of timber and iron scaffolding, topped with a copper hemisphere 55 feet across, that caught the afternoon light and held it, strange and luminous, like a second sun sitting just above the tree line. The smell of cut wood and turned earth still hung around the base of it. The ground for acres around had been excavated, tunneled into, shaped into what Tesla believed would be the root system of a new kind of world, a web of iron pipes and conduits driven deep into the earth to make the planet itself a conductor, to make the ground beneath your feet a wire. This was Wardenclyffe. And I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. I think this is the section of Tesla's life that stays with me the longest. Not the early triumphs, not the AC motor, not the light shows at the 1893 World's Fair. Those are exhilarating, but they are the ascending part of the story. And ascending is easy to love. What I find genuinely moving, in a way that is harder to put into words, is this: the tower, the years of diminishing hope, the specific morning in 1917 when the dynamite was set, the silence after. This is where the thesis of this whole story, why Tesla died alone, begins to earn itself. Because Wardenclyffe was not simply a failed experiment. It was the moment Tesla's vision of himself as the man who would transform the world began, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. Let me take you back to the beginning of it. The year is 1900. Tesla has just returned from Colorado Springs, where he spent 14 months inside a specially built laboratory, generating artificial lightning, filling his notebooks with observations about the electrical properties of the Earth and the atmosphere between the Earth and the ionosphere above it. He has convinced himself, and not without scientific basis, though the practical engineering remained enormously uncertain, that he can transmit both energy and information wirelessly through the planet itself. Not through wires, not point to point, but everywhere, simultaneously, to anyone with a receiver. Free electrical power, broadcast like a radio signal, available to any human being on Earth who wanted it. The scale of that idea, let it sit for a moment. Free, electrical power, for everyone. He needed money to build the transmission station that would prove it, and in 1901, he secured a meeting with the man who had money in quantities that matched the ambition of the idea, John Pierpont Morgan. Let me tell you about Morgan for a moment, because I think you will find him genuinely surprising, and because the caricature version of him, the cartoon robber baron, the cruel financier who crushed Tesla's dream out of spite, misses something important. Morgan in 1901 was 63 years old, heavyset, physically imposing, with a nose severely disfigured by rosacea, a condition he was acutely self-conscious about and that he forbade photographers from emphasizing in portraits. He was not a scientist, but he was not a fool. He had financed the formation of U.S. Steel, reorganized the American railroad system, and twice in his career had effectively stepped in to stabilize the United States economy when the government could not. He had also, just a few years earlier, financed the Edison General Electric Company, which had merged to become General Electric. He understood the power industry. He understood, specifically, what it meant to own the infrastructure of power distribution, the wires, the meters, the generating stations. Morgan agreed to give Tesla $150,000. It was a significant sum. He received in exchange a 51% stake in Tesla's patents and inventions, which was, from a pure investor's perspective, a fairly standard arrangement. Construction at Shoreham began almost immediately. But here is what Morgan almost certainly understood, and what Tesla may have underestimated in his eagerness to secure the money. Free wireless electricity was not simply a technical challenge. It was an economic impossibility within the existing infrastructure. Every investor in every existing power company, and Morgan had significant interests in such companies, would be annihilated by a technology that made electrical meters irrelevant. You cannot charge people for something that flows freely through the ground beneath their feet. The business model of the entire electrical industry was predicated on control of transmission. Tesla was proposing to dissolve that control, not as a political act, simply as a feature of the technology. Morgan, I think, understood this from the beginning. The question historians have debated is whether he funded Tesla despite this or because of this, or whether he simply miscalculated what Tesla's actual plans were. The biographer W. Bernard Carlson, in his carefully sourced 2013 study of Tesla's life, argues that Morgan's withdrawal of support had multiple causes, that the economics were one element, but that Morgan also grew frustrated with Tesla's escalating budget demands and with the way Tesla kept shifting the stated purpose of the project. Tesla had initially described Wardenclyffe primarily as a wireless telegraphy station. The full scope of his free energy ambitions came into clearer focus for Morgan only gradually. By 1902, construction costs had already exceeded the original budget. Tesla began writing Morgan letters asking for additional funds. Morgan declined. Tesla wrote again. Morgan declined again. The letters, which survive in the Morgan Library in New York, have a quality that historians have described as increasingly desperate, Tesla alternating between grand promises and what reads like something close to pleading. In one letter he reportedly wrote that the project was his life's work, and that without it he was nothing, though biographers are careful to note that the precise wording varies across accounts, and that the full correspondence deserves careful reading rather than selective quotation. By 1905, construction had effectively stopped. The tower stood, enormous and unfinished, above the flat Long Island landscape. The machinery inside the laboratory building was rusting. The men who had worked on the site had been let go. Tesla continued to visit, sometimes staying in the small room he had built for himself on the grounds. But the visits grew less frequent as the years passed, and the hope of renewed funding faded. He tried other investors. He wrote letters to Astor, to other financiers. No one came forward in quantities that matched the scale of what was needed. The tower stood there for 12 years after the funding stopped. 12 years is a long time to watch something you built, something you believed in, with every electrical impulse of your considerable intelligence, slowly become a monument to collapse. Pigeons roosted in the scaffolding. The wooden structure weathered and darkened. Local children occasionally dared each other to get close to it. Then came 1917. The United States had entered the First World War. The government became concerned, possibly with some justification, possibly with considerably more panic than justification, that the tower might be used as a reference point by German submarines navigating Long Island Sound, or possibly as a transmission station for enemy communications. The order came through. The tower was to be demolished. It was dynamited in the summer of 1917. The reports say the copper hemisphere came down first, sold as scrap metal to help offset what Tesla owed in back taxes on the property. Tesla later said that the destruction of Wardenclyffe broke his back. We cannot know, with certainty, where he was when the dynamite was set. The biographer Mark Cypher, in his exhaustive 1996 biography, notes that Tesla was not present at the demolition. Whether he was somewhere quiet in the city, whether he sat in a hotel room with the window closed against the summer heat while, 40 miles east on Long Island, the tower he had spent 15 years trying to save came down in cordite smoke and turned earth and splinters, we do not know. It is tempting to imagine him simply sitting still, not working, not writing, just sitting. Back to the story now and the shape of what came after, because Wardenclyffe was the fracture point, and everything that followed, including the room and the door with the sign on it, and the maid who eventually decided to try the handle, everything after follows from this. The drawing rooms of Upper Manhattan in the 1890s had a particular smell, gas lamps giving way, slowly and then all at once, to electric light, and with that transition, the faint sulphurous memory of the old way of doing things hanging in the curtains, in the upholstery, even as the new bulbs hummed their clean, toneless hum overhead. Cut flowers on every surface. Good tobacco from the library. The smell of a dinner party warming itself up. Bread rolls, a roast somewhere behind a closed kitchen door. The light chemical sweetness of a woman's perfume when she leaned close to say something amusing. This was the world Tesla moved through in his prime. The Johnson household at 327 Lexington Avenue was the particular center of it. Robert Underwood Johnson, the poet and associate editor of Century magazine, and his wife Catherine, a woman of considerable intelligence, warmth, and something that can fairly be described as genuine emotional generosity, had taken Tesla into their social orbit sometime in the early 1890s, not long after his famous demonstrations of alternating current had made him the most talked-about scientist in America. He was brilliant, strange, impeccably dressed, and entirely without family in a city that ran on the fuel of connection. The Johnsons understood this, or felt it, or simply liked him enough that the distinction didn't matter. I find this detail genuinely moving, the way certain households function in the lives of solitary people, not as a substitute for something, not as a lesser version of belonging, but as the actual thing, the real human warmth, even if the solitary person in question can't quite name it as such. Tesla came to the Johnson table again and again over 2 decades. He ate their food, he sat in their parlor, he played with their children. He was, by every account, a beloved and regular presence. And then, gradually, he wasn't. Let me tell you something about Katherine Johnson's letters, because I think you will find them genuinely surprising, and because they matter enormously to understanding what Tesla lost, and perhaps never fully recognized he was losing. The correspondence between Katherine Johnson and Tesla, portions of which are housed in the Tesla papers at Columbia University's rare book and manuscript library, reveals a warmth on her side that goes somewhat beyond the ordinary affection of a hostess for a favorite guest. The biographer, W. Bernard Carlson, in his deeply researched 2013 work, Tesla, Inventor of the Electrical Age, notes the unusual emotional register of these letters, the frequency of them, the intimacy of their tone, the way Katherine wrote to Tesla during his absences as though the absence itself was a specific felt thing. She chided him, gently, for disappearing. She described the house as quieter without him. She asked about his work in the way people ask when they actually want to know, not merely when they want to fill silence. Whether this correspondence represented something beyond friendship on Katherine's part is a question historians have handled with appropriate care. It was a different era, with different conventions of emotional expression, and the letters that have survived represent only a portion of what was written. What can be said with some confidence is that Katherine Johnson offered Tesla a quality of attentive, sustained human warmth that he encountered rarely, if ever, from anyone else. She saw him, she kept seeing him, through the years of triumph and the early years of struggle, through the strangeness of his habits and the grandiosity of his plans. And Tesla, as far as the record shows, received this warmth politely, appreciated it abstractly, and never quite metabolized it into anything that changed how he lived. The biographer Mark Cypher, in Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, suggests that Tesla's emotional landscape was, in some essential way, sealed off, not maliciously, not from indifference, but from something closer to a structural incapacity, a circuitry that processed human connection differently than most people's does. Tesla himself, in his autobiography and various public statements, spoke of his celibacy and his solitude as conscious choices, as conditions of his genius rather than deprivations. He said, famously, that he had dedicated himself entirely to his work. The records suggest he believed this. What the records cannot tell us is whether, at some level below the one he had access to, the man who came so often to 327 Lexington Avenue was looking for something he could not name and therefore could not ask for. The dinner party sound in those rooms was very specific. High voices and low ones braided together, the clink of good crystal, laughter timed to the rhythm of someone's story, the sound of people who believe, correctly or incorrectly, that they are at the center of the world's most interesting conversation. Mark Twain was sometimes there. He and Tesla had what can only be described as a genuine mutual enchantment, a friendship between two people who recognized in each other a particular quality of aliveness. Tesla let Twain hold his oscillator once, in the laboratory, and by several accounts Twain found the experience so pleasurable he didn't want to stop. Twain died in 1910. By then the frequency of Tesla's visits to the Johnsons had already begun to thin. Robert Underwood Johnson remained loyal to Tesla long past the point where loyalty was convenient or reciprocated with any consistency. He advocated for Tesla in print. He wrote letters on his behalf. He nominated him for honors. Johnson was a man of genuine romantic idealism. He had translated Dante, championed causes, believed in the idea of the artist and the inventor as figures deserving of the culture's reverence and care. Tesla fit this template so precisely that Johnson's loyalty had something almost literary about it, a quality of faith in a protagonist. But Tesla was not easy to remain close to. The obsessions deepened. The Wardenclyffe project, the great tower on Long Island, meant to be a wireless power transmission station that would change everything, consumed him entirely through the early years of the century, and then failed, devastatingly, when J.P. Morgan withdrew his funding in 1903. After Wardenclyffe, Tesla was never quite the same. He became more brittle, more grandiose, more difficult. The phobias that had always been present, he had always had trouble with round objects, with certain textures, with touching other people's hair, became more pronounced, more governing of his daily life. The social world that had embraced the brilliant, eccentric immigrant began to find the brilliant, eccentric, increasingly isolated older man harder to embrace back. George Westinghouse, whose company had built its fortune in no small part on Tesla's AC patents, and who had made the genuinely extraordinary gesture in the early 1890s of tearing up Tesla's royalty contract when the company faced financial difficulty, sparing Tesla from a potential windfall but demonstrating a personal loyalty that Tesla spoke of with genuine emotion for the rest of his life, died in 1914. With him went another of the sturdy human structures that had given Tesla's world some shape. I want to be honest with you about something. The thesis of this series is right there in its title, that Tesla died alone, and that there were real reasons for it, complicated and human, and worth understanding. What this section of his life shows, I think, is that the aloneness was not imposed on him all at once from outside. It accumulated. It was made of 100 moments when connection was offered and not quite grasped. Katherine Johnson's letters, Twain's laughter in a warm room, Johnson's tireless advocacy, Westinghouse's handshake on a torn-up contract. These were not nothing. These were, actually, quite a lot. The question that stays with me, the one I think about more than I probably should, is whether Tesla knew what those things were while he still had them. Whether the warmth of that particular drawing room on Lexington Avenue landed somewhere inside him and stayed, or whether it passed through him the way certain kinds of light pass through certain kinds of glass, present, real, leaving no lasting trace. The invitations eventually slowed. The friends eventually died. The rooms he had moved through so easily grew quiet and then quieter still, and Tesla moved on, or rather, did not move on, but simply found the world contracting around him until it was the size of a hotel room, a windowsill, a few pigeons who came when he called. Back with Tesla now, in the decade ahead, and the wound that would not close, and the bitterness that would take what the loneliness left behind. The documents were heavy. That is where I want to begin, not with the grandeur of the legal battle, not with the science, but with the physical weight of paper. Legal briefs in the early 20th century were substantial things, printed on thick cream stock, bound with ribbon or cord, stacked in manila folders that accumulated over months, and then years, and then decades. Tesla's patent attorneys would have moved through offices heavy with that smell, ink and dust and the particular mustiness of paper that has been handled many times, turned over, annotated in pencil in the margins, set down again. To pursue a patent dispute of the magnitude Tesla pursued against Guglielmo Marconi was to live inside that smell, to wake up knowing that somewhere in a filing cabinet or a court clerk's office, your name was attached to a claim you believed with your entire being to be true, and that the world had not yet agreed with you. He began his formal legal challenge to Marconi's radio patents in 1915, though the grievance itself reached back much further, to the late 1890s, when Marconi had assembled a wireless transmission system using components that Tesla believed derived directly from his own patented work. Tesla had filed his basic radio patents in 1897. Marconi's first successful transatlantic wireless transmission came in 1901. The US Patent Office initially granted Marconi's patents anyway. Tesla reportedly said, at the time, something to the effect that Marconi was a good fellow, and he was using 17 of Tesla's patents, though the exact phrasing varies across historical accounts, and we should not treat it as a verbatim quotation. What we can say is that the essential claim was documented and documented early. Tesla believed the foundations of wireless telegraphy belonged to him. Not partially, entirely. And that belief, which had genuine technical merit, would become one of the defining weights of the rest of his life. I want to be honest with you about something. There is a version of this story, the popular version, the one that circulates in the form of motivational posters and internet infographics, in which Tesla is a pure martyr, a saint of science robbed clean by a cruel and mercenary world. And while I have a great deal of sympathy for Tesla, I think that version does him a disservice, because it leaves out the thing that I find genuinely moving and genuinely tragic, which is this. Tesla's grievance was real, his wound was real, but the way he carried it, the space it occupied inside him, the years it consumed, that was something he participated in too. The wound was real, the infection was his. The US Patent Office had actually reversed its position on Marconi's patent for four-circuit radio tuning as early as 1903, restoring priority to Tesla, a fact that rarely makes the infographics. But Marconi's wealth and public profile, and his 1909 Nobel Prize for Physics, secured his place in the public imagination as the father of radio in a way that legal determinations could not dislodge. Tesla watched this. He watched from New York, where his finances had been in varying states of collapse since the failure of Wardenclyffe, where he was no longer building great things but pursuing recognition for great things he had already built. The distinction matters. It is one thing to be fighting for the future. It is another to be fighting for the past. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the Nobel Prize in the early 20th century, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. The prize was still young. Alfred Nobel had died in 1896, and the first prizes were awarded in 1901. The selection process was opaque by today's standards, conducted largely through private nominations and committee deliberations in Stockholm that the outside world could not fully observe. In October 1915, newspapers including the New York Times reported that Tesla and Thomas Edison were expected to share that year's Nobel Prize in Physics. It was treated as a near certainty. Tesla had reportedly been contacted about it. And then, nothing. The prize that year went to William Henry Bragg and William Lawrence Bragg for their work on X-ray crystallography. Neither Tesla nor Edison was mentioned. What happened is genuinely unclear. Historians have offered various explanations, that Tesla and Edison had both declined, or that one had declined in protest at sharing the prize with the other, or that the report had simply been premature speculation that the Nobel Committee never confirmed. The biographer W. Bernard Carlson, in his deeply researched 2013 biography, simply titled Tesla, treats the incident as documented fact of announcement, but notes that the reasons for the outcome remain murky. What is not murky is how it must have registered. For a man who was already acutely conscious of credit and recognition, who had spent years watching Marconi receive the prize, the world assumed Tesla had helped make possible. This particular episode would have been one of those moments that leaves a mark on a person, a scar that doesn't show on the outside. Back with Tesla now, in the years when the legal battle was grinding forward through American courts. The Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company was rich. It had institutional backing, government contracts, and the sustained goodwill that came from being the recognizable name in a glamorous technology. Tesla had notebooks and patents, and a conviction that ran so deep it had become indistinguishable from his identity. The US government had actually cancelled Marconi's patents and restored priority to Tesla in some areas during the First World War, partly for practical financial reasons, since paying licensing fees to a foreign-held company was complicated, And then the situation had shifted again after the war. The legal landscape was dense and inconsistent, and each shift must have felt, to Tesla, like the ground moving under his feet. Cold ground, uncertain ground, the kind of ground that teaches you not to trust what seems solid. The Supreme Court case that would ultimately vindicate him, Marconi Wireless Telegraph Co. of America v. United States, was decided on June 21, 1943, 5 months after Tesla died. I think about this more than I probably should. The ruling came. It came clearly. The Supreme Court, in a majority opinion, determined that Tesla's patents predated and superseded Marconi's in fundamental respects. It was, by any legal measure, a vindication. It was the outcome he had been pursuing, in one form or another, for the better part of 4 decades, and he was not there to receive it. He had been dead for 5 months. He had died in January in a dim hotel room on the 33rd floor, alone, while the case was still working its way toward resolution. The vindication arrived in a world that had already moved past the moment when it could have done him any good. The historian Mark Cypher, in his biography, Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, documents Tesla's bitterness around the Marconi dispute with particular care, and what emerges from that documentation is not simply a portrait of an angry man, but of a man whose anger had become structural, load-bearing, in the way that certain old injuries become load-bearing inside a body. You move around them, you organize your posture around them, and gradually, almost without noticing, the injury begins to determine the shape of how you move through the world. We cannot know with certainty what Tesla felt in his quietest moments when he thought about Marconi. The records don't give us that, but we can imagine, and I think we are not wrong to imagine, that there was something exhausting about being right for so long without being acknowledged as right, that the bitterness was not simple anger but something more complicated and more corrosive, the particular loneliness of a man who has been correct, who knows he has been correct, and who finds that correctness an insufficient consolation for what has been taken from him. The crackle of a wireless signal, travelling invisible through air. The information was real. The signal was real. The question of whose name would be attached to it, that was something else. That was the weight he carried, heavy as a legal brief, heavy as decades of waiting for a world to catch up to what you already knew. The papers were everywhere. That is the first thing anyone noticed when they entered room 3327 in those final years. Not the pigeons on the windowsill, not the dim quality of the light through curtains that were rarely fully opened. The papers, stacked on every available surface in a system that was legible only to the man who had created it. Notebooks filled with a handwriting that had grown smaller and more compressed over the decades, calculations spiraling into the margins, letters received and never sent, diagrams of devices that existed nowhere but in those pages and in the mind that had produced them. The smell was particular, birdseed and something chemical, a faint industrial sharpness from the cleaning solutions Tesla insisted the hotel staff use in precise combinations and precise quantities. Beneath those smells, the deeper smell of a room that has been breathed in for a long time by one person and one person only. The smell of a life turned almost entirely inward. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further into this section, because it matters to how we understand what happened to Tesla in these years. There is a version of this story, a very popular version, in which Tesla's eccentricities are simply the charming price of genius. The man who counted his footsteps and wouldn't touch circular objects and demanded 18 napkins with every meal is presented, in that version, as delightfully strange, a genius so large that normal human constraint simply could not contain him. It is a comfortable story. It lets us feel fond rather than troubled. I do not think that is the honest story. The honest story is harder and, I think, more genuinely moving, because what the records actually suggest, what the biographer W. Bernard Carlson explores with real care in his 2013 biography. Tesla, inventor of the electrical age, which remains probably the most rigorously researched account we have, is that Tesla's compulsions were not charming. They were not incidental. They were, in Carlson's reading, the external expression of a psychological architecture that made sustained human intimacy functionally, genuinely, practically impossible. That is the piece of this story worth sitting with tonight. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about what modern psychology allows us to understand here, because I think you will find it genuinely clarifying, and I want to be careful about it. We cannot and should not reach backward through 80 years and apply a clinical diagnosis to a man who cannot speak for himself. That would be both methodologically dishonest and, in a real sense, unkind. But Carlson, and other scholars who have worked carefully with Tesla's own accounts of his inner experience, have noted that what Tesla described, throughout his life, in his memoir, My Inventions, and in interviews, bears recognizable similarity to what we would now understand as obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and possibly features consistent with what we would now place somewhere on the neurodevelopmental spectrum, the repetitive rituals. The extreme sensory sensitivities, Tesla described being genuinely distressed by the sight of pearl earrings, by certain sounds, by the specific texture of some materials against his skin. The intense capacity for focused attention in one domain, paired with what seemed like an almost complete inability to navigate the social and emotional demands of ordinary human relationship. What modern psychology offers us, not a diagnosis, but a framework, is this. These were not, in any simple sense, choices. The counting was not affectation. The need for the 18 napkins folded in the precise way, arranged at the precise distance from the plate. This was Tesla's nervous system trying to impose order on a world that his senses experienced as overwhelming, as too loud, as too close, as too full of unpredictability. And here is the thing I find myself returning to, the thing I think about more than I probably should. What must it have cost him, every single day, simply to be in the presence of other people? Back with Tesla now, in room 3327, in the late 1930s. The birthday press conferences had become a ritual of their own by then, and they had taken on a quality that people who attended them found difficult to describe with kindness afterward. Every year, on the 10th of July, his birthday, which he celebrated with precision and ceremony, Tesla would invite journalists to his room or to a hotel dining room, and he would make announcements. The announcements had always been bold. In his prime, they had been bold and correct. He had announced things that seemed impossible and then built them. But by the late 1930s, the announcements had become untethered from anything that could be demonstrated or verified. There was the Teleforce weapon, what the press called the death ray, though Tesla disliked that phrase, a directed energy device he claimed could destroy aircraft at 200 miles, a defensive weapon that he said would make war impossible by making every nation equally impenetrable. He described it in technical terms that were specific enough to sound credible, but could never be tested because he never produced a working version, and the documents, if they existed in the form he implied, have never fully surfaced. There were claims about photographing thoughts, capturing mental images directly from the human brain onto photographic plates. There were, in earlier years, claims about receiving radio signals from other planets, signals he believed, with apparent sincerity, represented extraterrestrial intelligence. The journalists came, in those later years, partly out of habit, partly out of a faded residual respect, and partly, and this is the part that is hard to record without feeling something, out of something closer to voyeurism. Tesla would sit at the table in his dark suit, thin to the point of fragility by then, his eyes still quick and precise, and he would speak about his inventions with complete and total conviction, and the journalists would write it up with a gentleness that was itself a kind of condescension, the great man and his fancies. The narrator voice must yield here to something quieter. What the records suggest, and Carlson is particularly thoughtful on this, is that Tesla himself may have understood, on some level, that the gap between his claims and his demonstrable output had become impossible to bridge. He had not produced a major verified invention in decades. The patents had dried up. The laboratories were gone. Wardenclyffe, the great tower on Long Island that was supposed to transmit wireless power and information around the globe, had been demolished in 1917 to pay debts. We will come back to Wardenclyffe because it deserves its own full reckoning. And with it went something in Tesla that never quite reconstituted itself. The grandiosity of the later claims, the biographer Mark Cypher has suggested in Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, may represent something like a psychological compensation, a mind that had genuinely reshaped the modern world trying to maintain, in the only currency it had ever traded in, some claim to continued relevance. The announcements kept coming, because stopping them would have meant acknowledging something Tesla's entire psychological structure may have been incapable of acknowledging. The room grew quieter every year. The stack of papers grew taller. The curtains stayed closed a little longer each morning. And the thing that had always been true of Tesla, that the rituals and the compulsions and the sensory defenses formed a wall between him and other human beings, now operated in an almost completely empty space. There was no one left to push against the wall. The colleagues had drifted. The patrons had moved on. The journalists still came once a year and then left. What remained, in that corner room on the 33rd floor, smelling of birdseed and chemical soap, lit by light that never quite reached the corners, was a man and his papers and his numbers and, just outside the window, the soft, particular sound of wings. The windowsill of room 3327 was narrow, perhaps 8 inches of stone ledge between the glass and the open air, 33 floors above 8th Avenue. And yet, for nearly a decade, that ledge was the most important place in Nikola Tesla's world. Every morning, in the last years of his life, he would rise, slowly, now, the body that had once seemed to run on its own electrical current growing heavier, more reluctant. And he would go to the window, he would scatter birdseed along the ledge, and he would wait. They came. They always came. The pigeons of Midtown Manhattan, grey and iridescent and unremarkable to everyone else, would descend onto that particular ledge on the 33rd floor, and Tesla would watch them with an attention he had once given to the problems of alternating current and wireless energy. The same eyes, the same stillness. The sound of their wings settling, that soft, papery percussion, that sound like a deck of cards being shuffled by careful hands, filled the room. The smell of birdseed, of feathers, of the cold stone ledge, mixed with the particular chemical cleaners Tesla insisted upon throughout that long, diminishing decade. I want to stay here with you for a moment before we go any further, because this section is the one I have been building toward since we started tonight. Everything we have talked about, the financial collapse, the severed friendships, the deliberate withdrawal, the slow narrowing of a life, it all finds its fullest expression here, in this room, at this window, with these birds, and specifically, with one bird. I find this genuinely difficult to describe without either romanticizing it or flattening it, and I want to do neither. So let me just tell you what the record shows, and let it be what it is. There was a white pigeon. The biographer W. Bernard Carlson, in his deeply researched 2013 biography. Tesla, inventor of the electrical age, notes that Tesla spoke and wrote about a particular female pigeon, white, with grey-tipped wings, with an intensity that was unlike anything he expressed about any human being in his later years. Tesla himself described her, in conversations with his friend and assistant Kenneth Swezey, as a beautiful bird, a pure, loving creature. He said, by multiple accounts, that he loved her, not in the vague, fond way a person might say they love a pet. He said, and this appears in multiple sources, including John J. O'Neill's biography. Prodigal Genius. Published in 1944, a year after Tesla's death, that he loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman. He said it plainly, without apparent embarrassment, as a statement of fact. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about Tesla and birds, because I think it will help you understand how this particular love was not an aberration. It was a culmination. Tesla noticed birds from childhood. Growing up in Smiljan, in what is now Croatia, he was a child of extraordinary sensory sensitivity, the kind of sensitivity that, as he wrote in his memoir, "My inventions could be both a gift and a genuine torment. Sounds were too loud, lights were too bright, textures on his skin could be unbearable, and yet the natural world, observed at a careful remove, fascinated him. He watched birds as a child, with the same precise attention he gave to mechanical problems. He studied the way they moved, the geometry of their flight. There is a remarkable detail in My Inventions, published in 1919, where Tesla describes as a very young boy attempting to construct a flying machine powered by the energy of captured June bugs. The machine was, as you might expect, not a success. But what the detail reveals is a mind that was always watching living things move through air, trying to understand the principles underneath, trying to find the mechanism behind the beauty. Later, as a young man in Budapest in 1882, during the period of his famous breakdown, the episode of extreme physical and psychological collapse that preceded his greatest inventions, he was taken outside by a friend to walk and recover. The natural world, trees and birds and open sky, was part of what pulled him back. These were not incidental comforts. They were, it seems, genuine anchors. And in New York, from the early 1900s onward, Tesla's relationship with the pigeons of the city became increasingly central to his daily life. He fed them regularly in Bryant Park, near the New York Public Library, for years. Hotel staff at the Waldorf Astoria, where he lived before his finances collapsed entirely, reportedly tolerated his bringing injured birds inside to care for them. He was meticulous about this. He spent his own money he increasingly did not have, on birdseed and, when birds were injured, on veterinary care. The biographer Carlson notes that by Tesla's final years at the New Yorker hotel, this was not a hobby, it was a vocation. It was where his emotional life lived. Back to that white pigeon now, because she is what this is really about. Tesla fed her for years. She learned his window. She came back, day after day, season after season, to that narrow ledge 33 floors above the street. And Tesla, in his Spartan room with its papers and its notebooks and its memories of a life that had been enormous and was now very small, waited for her. The accounts of what he felt when she arrived are, by the standards of the historical record, unusually vivid. He lit up. The heaviness of the man, the old age, the financial ruin, the isolation, the weight of all those broken promises, his own and others, seems to have lifted in those moments. We cannot know what the interior of Nikola Tesla felt like. The records don't give us that kind of access, and I would never claim they do. But the biographer O'Neill, who knew Tesla personally and spoke with him many times in his final years, describes a man for whom this bird represented something he had structured his entire life to avoid needing, and had found anyway. Something that loved him without complication, something that returned. It is tempting to wonder, as I have more than I probably should, whether Tesla recognized this himself, whether in his clearer moments he understood what the white pigeon represented, that she had gotten through. And then came the night she didn't. The accounts differ slightly in their particulars, but the essential story appears in O'Neill and has been repeated by subsequent biographers. One night, the precise date is not certain, Tesla was in his room when the white pigeon appeared at his window. But something was wrong. She was injured or ill. Her light, as Tesla apparently described it, was fading. He held her, it is said, cupped in his hands. The softness of her white feathers, warm and weightless the way birds always are, never quite what you expect, always somehow less substantial than their presence suggests. He held her, and he knew she was dying. And he knew something else. He said, "Again, this is O'Neill's account, and we should hold it with appropriate care," that as she died, there was a light from her eyes, an intense light, and that in that moment he knew his work was finished. That the meaning he had found in that small room, in that particular life, in those years of shrinking and deepening, it was complete. I find this, and I want to be honest with you, one of the most quietly devastating things I have encountered in researching this entire story. Not because it is tragic in any dramatic sense, but because of what it reveals about the shape of a life. Tesla died alone because every capacity for connection he possessed, and the record suggests those capacities were real, were deep, were always there, had found in the end a single place to rest, a white bird on a windowsill, the sound of wings in the morning, the weight of something small and warm and alive in hands that had once remade the world. She died first. And then, in the way of these things, the light began to go out of him too. The door to room 3327 was still locked when the morning of January 8th began. The Do Not Disturb sign had been hanging on the handle long enough that the maid, Alice Monaghan, had learned to read it as simply part of the room, a permanent condition, not a temporary request. But something on that particular morning made her try the door anyway. The stillness behind it, perhaps. The particular quality of silence that is different from ordinary quiet. She found him in his bed, fully clothed, the way he had taken to resting in his final years, as though sleep were something that required less preparation than it once had, or perhaps simply more haste. He had been dead, the coroner would estimate, for approximately 24 hours. The room around him held the accumulated particularity of a life lived very long and very inwardly. Stacks of paper, notebooks whose pages had grown soft at the corners from repeated handling, the windowsill still faintly marked with birdseed. The pigeons were gone. The man was gone. The room smelled of old paper and the chemical cleaners Tesla had always insisted upon, and underneath both of those things, something else. The particular dusty warmth of a space that has been inhabited for a very long time by someone who almost never opened the windows. I want to be honest with you about what happens next, because I think it is one of the more unsettling things I have encountered in researching this particular story, and I have spent a considerable amount of time sitting with it. Tesla's body had not been in the city morgue long before the first men arrived at the New Yorker hotel, with official paperwork and empty boxes. They came quickly. Whatever one thinks of what they found, and we will get to that, they came with genuine urgency, which tells you something about what they expected to find. The men who came were agents operating under the authority of the Office of Alien Property Custodian, a wartime government body that, in the climate of January 1943, held extraordinary powers. They moved through the corridor of the New Yorker hotel in the way that men with official paperwork tend to move, purposefully, without particular haste, carrying the quiet authority of the institutional. Their coats were dark. Their shoes on the corridor carpet made almost no sound. They had, by most accounts, boxes, the cardboard kind, functional and undignified. And into those boxes went the accumulated intellectual residue of 8.5 decades of one of the stranger and more brilliant minds the modern world had produced. The notebooks slid against each other with a soft, papery friction as they were loaded. Correspondence was gathered. There were drawings, diagrams for systems and devices in various stages of theoretical completion, ideas that had lived for years only in pencil on paper and in the private landscape of one man's extraordinary and increasingly isolated mind. 2 truckloads, by most accounts, approximately 2 truckloads of material removed from rooms 3327 and 3325 of the New Yorker hotel, carried down in the elevator and out through the lobby and into government custody, within hours of the death being formally reported. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the Office of Alien Property Custodian, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Not as a shadowy conspiracy, but as a very specific and very human product of its particular historical moment. The Office of Alien Property had its origins in the First World War, when the United States government created mechanisms for seizing assets belonging to enemy nationals, property, patents, bank accounts, to prevent them from being used against American interests. It was revived and significantly expanded after Pearl Harbor, as the country moved onto a wartime footing that touched nearly every institution. By January 1943, 14 months into American involvement in the Second War, and in the same weeks that Allied forces were still locked in the grinding campaign across North Africa, the office had sweeping authority to seize and hold property belonging to any person deemed an alien whose assets might represent a security concern. Tesla, despite having lived in the United States for more than 60 years, had never completed the naturalization process. He was, in the legal vocabulary of the Office of Alien Property, an alien, a Yugoslav national, born in what is now Serbia, subject to the same wartime provisions as anyone else who had not formally claimed American citizenship. And he had spent years publicly claiming that he was working on something he called Teleforce, a directed energy weapon, a charged particle beam, a device he described in various public statements throughout the 1930s as being capable of downing aircraft at great distances. The newspapers had called it a death ray. Tesla had called it something rather more dignified. The government, in January of 1943, had reason to wonder whether any of those notebooks contained something real. The particular irony of this, and I find it one of the quiet, devastating ironies of this whole story, is that Tesla had spent decades trying to interest the United States government in his weapons research. He had written letters, he had sent proposals, he had met with officials and outlined systems he believed could change the nature of modern warfare. The government had, for the most part, declined to engage seriously. And now, within hours of his death, that same government sent men with boxes to his hotel room to collect what it had never been willing to fund while he was alive to defend it. Back with Tesla's papers now, and what was actually found in them. The man assigned to evaluate the seized materials was Dr. John G. Trump, an electrical engineer at MIT, a serious and well-regarded scientist who worked on radar development during the war and who was, by any reasonable account, competent to assess what he was looking at. Trump spent time with the notebooks. He reviewed the correspondence, the diagrams, the theoretical frameworks Tesla had been developing and revising across decades. His report, delivered to the government, concluded that Tesla's papers contained nothing that represented significant technical novelty or immediate military application. Nothing, in Trump's assessment, that the existing state of electrical engineering could not already account for. The Teleforce weapon, if it existed in any workable form, did not appear to exist in those boxes. I have thought about this conclusion rather more than I probably should. I want to be careful here, because Trump was a serious scientist, and his assessment deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed as institutional blindness. The evidence suggests that by the end of his life, Tesla's theoretical work had become increasingly disconnected from the kind of practical, verifiable research that produces implementable results. The biographer W. Bernard Carlson, whose 2013 study of Tesla remains one of the most rigorously researched accounts of his life, has argued that Tesla's later years were marked by a significant decline in his ability to translate his conceptual frameworks into anything that could be tested, built, or shared. The notebooks were the record of a mind that had genuinely been extraordinary, and that had, in its final decades, become somewhat lost inside itself, which is not the same as saying the notebooks were worthless. It is simply to say that what was found in those boxes was not the world-altering arsenal of secret knowledge that either Tesla or his admirers had imagined. The room had held a man who believed he was still sitting on the future. The boxes held the evidence that the future had, somewhere along the way, moved on without him. The materials remained in government custody for some time before eventually being returned, not to any American institution, but to Belgrade, where they now reside in the Nikola Tesla Museum, catalogued and preserved, available to researchers who make the journey to study them. The room on the 33rd floor of the New Yorker Hotel was cleaned and reassigned. It is a hotel room again. People sleep there without knowing, usually, what particular weight of history the walls once held. The smell of birdseed and chemical cleaner and old paper. The long, careful dark of a man who had decided, in the end, that the world outside was better managed from a distance. The men in dark coats came and went in an afternoon. The boxes were loaded, the elevator descended, and room 3327 was left with nothing in it but the particular silence that comes after a very long life has been carried out the door. The check arrived once a month, $100, transferred by the Westinghouse Electric Company to cover the cost of room 3327 and its adjoining room at the New Yorker Hotel on 8th Avenue. $100, a sum that would have meant very little to a company whose entire industrial existence had been built, in no small part, on the alternating current system that Nikola Tesla had conceived, perfected, and then, in one of the most genuinely staggering acts of financial self-destruction in the history of American industry, given away. The check was quiet. It arrived without ceremony, without a letter, without the name of any particular person attached to it. It was a line item in a corporate ledger somewhere in Pittsburgh. It kept a man alive on the 33rd floor of a Manhattan hotel. And I find myself returning to that check, to its particular texture of institutional conscience, more than almost any other detail in this entire story. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further. This section of Tesla's life is the one I find most difficult to sit with cleanly, because the temptation, when you tell this story, is to land on one of two simple positions. Either the world failed him, the cruel machinery of industrial capitalism chewed up a genius and discarded him, and everything that followed was the world's fault. Or he failed himself. He was difficult and obsessive and financially reckless, and he drove away the people who might have saved him, and everything that followed was his own doing. Both of those positions are available, and I think both of them are, on their own, insufficient. What I want to do in this section is something harder. I want to sit with both truths at once. I want to look honestly at what was done to Tesla, what was genuinely and measurably taken from him, and hold that alongside everything we've already talked about, the self-imposed dimensions of his aloneness, the choices he made, the particular architecture of his own withdrawal, because the real reason he died alone is not one thing, it never is. The papers in room 3327 were stacked in order he alone understood, notebooks going back decades, correspondence with men who were now dead or had long since stopped writing, calculations in a handwriting that had grown smaller and more compressed over the years, as though the ideas themselves were contracting. The room smelled of birdseed and the specific chemical cleaners Tesla insisted upon. He was, in his final years, deeply particular about cleanliness, almost phobic about it, a habit the biographer W. Bernard Carlson has connected to the obsessive-compulsive patterns that had structured Tesla's inner life since childhood. The window ledge bore the marks of the pigeons that gathered there each morning, and the sound of their soft percussion against the glass was, by most accounts, one of the few sounds Tesla seemed to welcome. He had been in this room for a decade. The Westinghouse check had been arriving for years. Let me tell you something about that arrangement, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising, not in a sensational way, but in the way that makes you go quiet and stare at the ceiling for a moment. The payment was not, as far as the historical record shows, the result of a personal relationship between Tesla and anyone currently employed at Westinghouse. George Westinghouse himself had died in 1914. The men who had worked directly alongside Tesla in the extraordinary years of the 1890s were gone or long retired. The check came from the company as an institution, and that distinction matters enormously, because an institution paying for a man's hotel room is a very different thing from a person choosing to take care of another person. The biographer Mark Cypher, in his comprehensive account, Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, describes the arrangement as a kind of corporate conscience payment, a belated and imperfect acknowledgement of what the company owed the man. We cannot know exactly how Tesla experienced it, but we can sit with the question of what it means to be kept alive by an organization's guilt rather than a person's love. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about George Westinghouse himself, because I think this is a question that deserves a fuller telling. Westinghouse was not a villain in Tesla's story. He was something more interesting and more complicated than that. He was a man who genuinely believed in Tesla at a moment when almost no one else of industrial consequence did. In 1888, when Tesla's patents on the alternating current induction motor were being dismissed or ignored by much of the electrical establishment, it was Westinghouse who came to Tesla's laboratory in Lower Manhattan, who looked at what Tesla had built, and who wrote a check, a very large check, reportedly including royalty agreements that, if they had been honored in full, would have made Tesla one of the wealthiest men in America. Westinghouse took on Edison directly and publicly in the war of currents, staking his company's future on the belief that AC power would win. It did win. The lights at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the illumination of the White City, one of the most spectacular public demonstrations of electrical power the world had seen, ran on Westinghouse's system, Tesla's system. Niagara Falls followed, and then the world was wired differently than it had been before, and Westinghouse's company grew into one of the great industrial powers of the American century. So here is the complicated truth. Westinghouse believed in Tesla, championed him, risked real capital on him, and in doing so became extraordinarily wealthy from Tesla's ideas. And when Westinghouse came to Tesla in the early 1890s and explained that the royalty agreements were going to bankrupt the company, that Westinghouse Electric could not survive the payments it had promised, Tesla tore up the contracts. He tore up documents that would have made him a multimillionaire, because he believed in Westinghouse as a man and in the importance of getting AC power into the world. W. Bernard Carlson and other scholars of this period are careful to note that the full details of this moment are somewhat disputed across the historical record. The romantic version, of Tesla literally tearing up a royalty check in a grand gesture, may be partly mythologized. But the substance is not in doubt. Tesla surrendered significant financial claims in a way that altered the entire trajectory of his later life. He gave something away, and the world and Westinghouse received it. Back with Tesla in room 3327, $100 a month. I am not saying Westinghouse was a villain. I am saying that the particular distance between what Tesla gave and what he received in return is one of those measurements that you can sit with for a long time and still not entirely resolve. The historian W. Bernard Carlson has written that Tesla genuinely did not seem to prioritize financial security in the way most people do, that his relationship to money was always secondary to his relationship to the work. That is true, and it is also true that the structures of Gilded Age industrial capitalism were not designed to protect the interests of inventors once their inventions had been absorbed. The patent system, the royalty structures, the way that companies owned and monetized the ideas of the people they contracted with, all of this was arranged in ways that consistently transferred wealth upward and away from the people who had the original ideas. Tesla was not alone in being consumed by this machinery. He was, perhaps, simply more completely consumed than most. The check for $100 was the end of that long accounting. It was what the institution had left to offer. And it is tempting to imagine, and I say imagine because we cannot know, that Tesla, in his later years, understood this with great clarity, that he sat in his dim corner room, with the birds moving against the glass and the papers stacked in their particular order, and he understood exactly what he had given and exactly what remained. The biographer Cipher suggests Tesla rarely spoke of Westinghouse in bitterness in his final years. Whether that was equanimity or exhaustion or simply the privacy of a man who had stopped explaining himself to anyone, we cannot say. What we can say is that the check kept coming, and that he was alive, and alone, and that the lights in the hallway outside his door, lights that worked the way they worked because of what his mind had once made, burned on without acknowledgement, the way the world tends to use the gifts it has been given. The narrator voice. Every July 10th, for the last decade and more of his life, Nikola Tesla held a birthday press conference. He would arrange for a table. He would dress, always with care, the dark suit pressed, the cuffs precise, the tie knotted in that particular way he had insisted on since his days of genuine Gilded Age splendor. He would prepare notes, or sometimes simply prepare himself, which was not quite the same thing, and the reporters would come. In the later years, in the New Yorker hotel, the conference took place in the rooms themselves, 3327 and 3325, corner rooms on the 33rd floor, the July light coming through the windows at an angle that fell across the papers stacked on every surface, the notebooks, the penciled calculations that covered page after page in Tesla's small, deliberate hand. The rooms smelled of birdseed. They smelled of the particular chemical cleaners Tesla requested and that the hotel staff supplied. They smelled, faintly, of pigeons, because the windowsill was always populated, always active, always attended to with a tenderness that people who visited these rooms in the 1930s found, depending on their temperament, touching or unsettling. The reporters sat or stood where they could. They opened their notebooks. They uncapped their pens. They waited for Nikola Tesla, who was by then in his late 70s and then his early 80s, to tell them what he had invented. Host voice. Let me tell you something about Tesla's relationship with the press, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because I think it is one of the most quietly revealing arcs in his whole long story. In the 1890s, Nikola Tesla was the most famous scientist in the world. Not one of the most famous, the most. When he demonstrated his alternating current system, when he lit up the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 with light that seemed, to people who had grown up with gas lamps and candles, frankly miraculous, the press responded the way press responds to genuine wonder, with breathless, careful attention. Journalists tried to understand the science. They wrote long explanatory pieces. They took his work seriously as work. By the 1910s, that had shifted. The Wardenclyffe project had collapsed. The money was gone. The tower had been demolished, sold for scrap, and the dream of wireless energy transmission across the entire planet had quietly died. Tesla was still famous, genuinely famous, the kind of fame that outlasts immediate relevance. But the nature of the fame had changed. It had become a kind of cultural furniture. Tesla the visionary, Tesla the eccentric, Tesla the man who was maybe ahead of his time. And by the 1930s, when the birthday press conferences were happening in room 3327, the coverage had shifted again. The reporters still came. They always came. But the historian W. Bernard Carlson, whose biography, Tesla, Inventor of the Electrical Age, is probably the most rigorous scholarly account we have, notes that in these later years the press conferences functioned less as scientific reporting events and more as something closer to annual ritual. The journalists came because Tesla was Tesla, because there would be a story, because the old man would say something startling, and the startling thing, whatever it was, would be worth half a column. I find this detail genuinely moving and also genuinely sad, because the thing about ritual is that it can look, from the outside, exactly like respect. The narrator voice. The announcements Tesla made at the later birthday press conferences were extraordinary. In 1931, he told reporters he was working on a new source of energy, one that came from the medium that fills all space. In 1933, he announced that he had developed a method of converting cosmic rays directly into electrical power. In 1934, he described what he called a death beam, a directed energy weapon capable of destroying 10,000 aircraft at a distance of 200 miles or stopping armies in their tracks. The reporters wrote it all down. The scratch of pencils in the notebooks, the particular sound of a New York July afternoon coming up through the window from 800 feet below, traffic, someone's radio, the city's constant enormous presence. Tesla at the table, the famous blue-grey eyes still sharp in the diminished face, his voice carrying the Serbian lilt it had never quite lost, speaking of weapons and rays and world peace with the same calm certainty he had once used to describe the rotating magnetic field. He called the weapon Teleforce. He claimed it would make war impossible by making any offensive action suicidal. He was, in his own framing, describing an instrument of permanent peace. The historical record is genuinely uncertain about how developed these ideas were, whether they represented active, serious research, or a kind of sustained, imaginative work that had become increasingly disconnected from the experimental rigor of his earlier career. Carlson and other scholars suggest the latter, carefully and without condescension. The ideas were real. Whether the implementations were progressing is a different question. What is certain is that the press covered it, and what is also certain is that the coverage carried, increasingly, a particular tone, not dismissal, not cruelty, something more like the gentle, slightly embarrassed attention one pays to an elder who is explaining something you no longer quite believe. Host voice. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it sits at the heart of what this section is really about. The biographer Mark Cypher in Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, raises a question that I think about more than I probably should. He wonders whether Tesla knew, whether Tesla understood, on some level, that the reporters were coming not because of genuine scientific anticipation, but out of habit, and perhaps something like mild, affectionate pity. We cannot know. The records don't reach that far into the interior, but we can wonder. And when you hold the image of this man, who in 1895 had stood in his own laboratory and watched the most sophisticated electrical workshop in the world burn to the ground and simply began again, who had once had the ear of presidents and industrialists and the greatest scientific minds on the planet, when you hold that image alongside the image of him arranging his notes at a hotel room table while reporters arrived out of something they themselves might have struggled to name, the question feels important. Stay with me here, because I think there are actually three possible answers, and all three of them might be true simultaneously. The first is defiance. Tesla had been told, repeatedly, by the world's financial and scientific establishment that his ideas were finished, that the resources were gone, that he had outlived his moment. The press conferences were, on this reading, his refusal to accept that verdict, his annual insistence that he was still present, still working, still mattering. The second is genuine belief. There is nothing in the record that convincingly suggests Tesla stopped believing in his own work. He was not performing relevance. He experienced relevance. The notebooks from these final years are full of real ideas, worked through with real care, even if their relationship to executable reality had loosened. The third is structure. In a life that had otherwise lost most of its scaffolding, the colleagues gone, the laboratories gone, the funding gone, the visitors reduced to a handful, July 10th was a date, a fixed point, something to prepare for, something to dress for, something that organized the otherwise formless weeks. Perhaps the birthday press conference was all three of these things at once, an act of defiance that was also an act of faith, that was also, simply, something to do. In December of 1937, Tesla left the hotel, as he still occasionally did, to feed the pigeons at Bryant Park and at the steps of the New York Public Library, a walk he had taken for years. On the way back, crossing a street near the hotel, he was struck by a taxicab. He was 81 years old. The impact threw him to the ground. He refused to be taken to a hospital. He made his way back to the hotel on his own, or was helped back. The accounts differ. He had 3 cracked ribs. He had, according to biographer Cypher, an injury to his back that troubled him for the rest of his life. He was in pain, and he was alone in the way that only a person who has systematically declined help for decades can be alone when something goes wrong. After that, he rarely left room 3327. The July afternoon light that had come through the windows at the birthday press conferences, that warm, heavy, Manhattan summer light, the kind that makes even concrete look briefly golden, continued to come. He would have felt it from the chair where he sat near the windowsill. He would have heard the pigeons settling. He would have felt the birdseed in his palm, and the particular weight of a bird's small body landing there, which he had described more than once as one of the genuine pleasures remaining to him. The world had not stopped. Below, 33 floors down, it continued at full volume. He could hear it. He simply was no longer part of it in the way he had once been, and had not been for a long time, and by now the room had taken on the quality that rooms do when a person has lived in them long enough alone. It had become an extension of the self, quiet and specific and held. The New Yorker hotel goes quiet after midnight in a particular way. The corridors, which during the day carry the sounds of carts and conversation and the mechanical percussion of the elevator doors, soften into something close to silence. Not complete silence. There is always, in a building of that size, the low structural hum of the heating system, the distant sound of the city pressing against the glass, the occasional creak of the building settling into itself against the winter cold. But after midnight, the 33rd floor becomes something close to still, and in January of 1943, in room 3327, the stillness had a particular quality to it. I want to be honest with you about something before we come to the end of this. I have been sitting with this story for a long time, longer than most, I think, and what I keep returning to is not the tragedy of the man's final years, in the way the romantic version of his story usually frames it, the version where the world simply failed to recognize genius. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. What I find genuinely moving and genuinely complicated is that Tesla arrived at room 3327 by a sequence of choices, losses, and withdrawals that were thoroughly, unmistakably his own. The world did not lock him in that room. He went there himself, and he stayed. The room was on the corner. 33 floors up, the windows looked out over a January Manhattan that was different in 1943 than it had been in the years before the war. The city was under partial blackout restrictions, not the absolute darkness of London under the Blitz, but a dimming, a turning down of the brilliant electrical spectacle that New York had been for decades. The rooftop signs that Tesla had once marveled at, the great arterial rivers of light running down Broadway and 8th Avenue, were quieter now, and because of that quieting, the sky above the city had a quality it rarely had, stars, faintly visible, through the cold January air. He could not have seen them well by then. His eyesight had deteriorated. He was 86 years old, and he had been unwell for months. A period of confusion and physical frailty that those who did encounter him in his final weeks noted with something between concern and unease. The Western Union messenger boy who visited the room in Tesla's last days. This detail appears in several biographies, including W. Bernard Carlson's careful 2013 study of Tesla's life, encountered a man who seemed both agitated and somehow absent, trying to press a package into the boy's hands, wanting something delivered, the errand unclear. The boy declined. He was unsettled by what he saw. The door with its "Do Not Disturb" sign closed again. The smell of the room in those final weeks was specific, birdseed, and the particular chemical sharpness of the cleaning solutions Tesla had always been meticulous about, and beneath those, the close, faintly warm smell of paper, notebooks, correspondence, the accumulated documentation of a mind that had never really stopped working. Every surface held paper. The notebooks were dense with equations and diagrams, with the architectural drawings of machines that had been built and machines that had never left the page. There were letters he had written and sent, and letters he had written and kept. There were the records of the Wardenclyffe Tower project, the great wireless transmission station on Long Island that had consumed his fortune and his credibility and had been demolished in 1917, the year the mortgage holder finally gave up waiting for Tesla to produce something profitable from it. The notebooks were still there when the room was opened on January 8th. Alice Monaghan, the maid who eventually overrode the Do Not Disturb sign because it had been there too long, found Tesla in his bed, fully clothed, the room around him dim and quiet. He had been dead for approximately 24 hours. The city had gone on below the 33rd floor through all of those hours. The taxis and the pedestrians and the hospitals and the radio broadcasts, and every building lit, more or less, by alternating current. And in room 3327, the man who had understood how to make all of that possible had simply, quietly stopped. Let me tell you about where Tesla is now, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because I think it matters to how we understand what his life meant and what happened to its record. His ashes rest in Belgrade, Serbia, in the Nikola Tesla Museum, which opened in 1952. The museum holds the largest collection of Tesla's original documents in the world, somewhere in the region of 60,000 documents, along with personal effects, models, and approximately 160,000 photographs and technical drawings. His ashes are kept in a golden sphere, a shape Tesla himself is said to have favored for its electromagnetic properties. The path his papers took to get there is its own story. When room 3327 was opened in January 1943, agents of the U.S. Office of Alien Property arrived. Tesla, despite decades in America, had never taken out citizenship and was technically classified as a Yugoslav national. The government, in the middle of a world war, was concerned about the Teleforce weapon Tesla had spent years claiming he had designed, a directed energy device capable, he said, of bringing down aircraft at 200 miles. The agents took approximately 2 truckloads of documents. An MIT electrical engineer named John G. Trump, a figure who would acquire a certain posthumous notoriety for reasons entirely unrelated to Tesla, was asked to review the papers and assess whether they contained anything of military significance. His conclusion, essentially, was that they did not, that Tesla's later work was largely speculative, marked more by aspiration than by the rigorous experimental method that had made his early work so transformative. Many of Tesla's papers were eventually returned to his nephew, Sava Kosanovic, and made their way to Belgrade. Scholars at the Tesla Museum have spent decades working through what is there. The question they keep returning to, the question that remains genuinely, productively unresolved, is the distinction between what Tesla discovered and what he imagined. His early work, the rotating magnetic field, the alternating current induction motor, the polyphase system demonstrated at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. These were real, documented, world-altering. His later claims, wireless transmission of power across the globe, the death ray, the artificial earthquake machine, remain controversial. Some engineers and physicists find in the notebooks the seeds of ideas that were simply ahead of the available technology. Others find the record of a brilliant mind that had, by degrees, lost its tether to the testable. The honest answer is probably both. And the honest response to that is not sadness exactly. It is something more like awe at the sheer scale of what the man attempted to imagine. Back in room 3327, on that January night, I find myself thinking about the view from the window. The city below, dimmed by wartime precaution, going about its business in the cold. The stars above, faintly more visible than usual. And in the room, the warmth of a bed, the weight of blankets, the smell of birdseed on the windowsill, where the pigeons came every morning. The white pigeon, the one Tesla had described, in the years before his death, as the great love of his life, the bird whose death he said had taken something from him that nothing had restored, was gone by then. She had died some years earlier. He had told the story of her death to journalists with a directness that unsettled them, because it was the most emotionally unguarded thing he had ever said in public, and it arrived late, when he was old and already mostly alone. The lights of the city went on below him. They went on through the night. They go on still, in hospitals and homes and late-night kitchens and bedrooms where people lie awake or drift towards sleep. The particular form of electricity that makes all of that possible, the alternating current system, the polyphase motor, the transformer technology demonstrated at Niagara Falls in 1895, is his. Not entirely, not without the engineers and investors and collaborators who built what he designed. But the fundamental understanding, the insight that arrived complete in a Budapest park in 1882, when he was 25 years old, and the idea simply appeared, whole, in his mind. That was his. He died in a room the world had mostly forgotten he was in, but the lights were on. They were always on. And somewhere in the quiet of that January night, in the particular stillness of a room where a person has just stopped breathing, there is something worth sitting with for a moment, before we let the story soften and come to rest. You do not need to hold on to the details now. Let them go easy. Let the room go quiet. We are almost at the end. I want to stay here with you for a little while longer, not to tell you anything new, just to sit with what we have already found. Room 3327, the New Yorker Hotel, a January night in 1943, and a man in his bed, fully clothed, the door sign turned outward, the pigeons somewhere close in the dark outside his window. The room quiet, the room very quiet. I keep returning to that image. I think I will keep returning to it long after I finish writing this, and I find myself uncertain whether it is a tragic image or a true one, whether those are even different things. The room is dark now. The city moves below, indifferent and glittering, the way cities always move, without awareness of what they contain, without ceremony for what is ending inside their walls. Somewhere in the hotel, a lift hums. Somewhere a door closes softly in a distant corridor. The radiator ticks. The window holds the cold of the January night against its glass like a held breath. And the man in the bed does not stir. Host voice. Here is the question I promised you we would sit with. The question the title asks. The real reason. And I want to be honest with you, the way I always try to be in this room we share when the lights are low. I don't think there is one reason. I think that is actually the answer, and I think it is a more interesting answer than any single villain or single betrayal could provide. Tesla died alone because he was a particular kind of person in a particular kind of world, and those two things met each other badly over a very long time. He was a man of extraordinary inner life and genuine difficulty in the ordinary transactions of human closeness. He was a man who needed admiration the way other people need warmth, and who found that need humiliating, and who therefore kept the people who might have provided it at a careful, dignified, ultimately fatal distance. He chose isolation, yes, but I think perhaps he chose it the way some of us choose things we are not entirely free to choose differently, out of the shape of who he already was, out of the walls that had already been built, over so many decades, so carefully, so quietly. Westinghouse did not abandon him. Edison was a rival, not a destroyer. The men and women who drifted from his life mostly did so because he made the drifting easier than the staying. He burned the Morgan relationship with his own grandiosity. He wore Katherine Johnson's devotion thin across years of self-absorption. He frightened off the journalists. He refused the Nobel. He kept people at the length of his own arm, and then, in his final years, he simply stopped extending the arm. I find this genuinely moving rather than simply sad, because I think most of us know something of that mechanism, the way pride can quietly become a cage, the way the belief that we do not need what we desperately need can harden, over years, into something that looks from the outside like preference. He preferred to be alone, and he did not prefer to be alone. Both of those things seem true to me. Narrator voice. The room is very still. The cold is very even across everything. The bedspread, the surface of the small table, the notebooks no one will read tonight. The pigeons are roosting somewhere close. Their breathing, if you could hear it, would be slow. Everything is slow now. A host voice. You do not need to hold on to any of the details now. The dates, the patents, the towers, the names. Let them go. Let them soften at the edges, the way everything softens when you are this close to sleep. What I hope you carry, if you carry anything at all, is something quieter than a fact. Something more like a question you don't need to answer tonight. Just the sense that a remarkable person lived a remarkable and genuinely difficult inner life, and that the two things were not separate. That the same mind that could imagine electricity arcing across the sky could not quite find its way to the ordinary grace of letting someone stay. That is not a condemnation. It is just a life. It is just what a life sometimes looks like from the far end of it. Wherever you are tonight, a bedroom with the heating on, a room where the window is dark and the house around you has finally gone quiet, somewhere with rain on the glass, somewhere with stars, whatever your own evening has held, I hope you are warm. I hope something today was worth it, and I hope you can let the rest of it go now, the same way he could not, the same way we practice, slowly, imperfectly, across all our own ordinary years. The room is dark, the city breathes. Somewhere, far above the street, above the hotel, above the low ceiling of cloud over Manhattan, there are stars. There were always stars. He knew their frequencies, their distances, their cold, patient light, crossing centuries to arrive here. He knew how far a signal could travel if you gave it enough power. It travels still. The room is dark and very still, and everything is quiet now. Sleep well, friend. Good night, wherever you are.